Now, one thing we also have to emphasize was into the 70s, and even in a certain sense to the early 80s, it looked like things were going better in North Korea than South Korea, right? And this is a quote. I'm going to refer to this book several times, but if you want like a crash course, if you want to know a lot about North Korea very quickly, read Michael Sess' North Korea, A History. It's a wonderful book. But he writes, and up to the early 1980s, life in terms of education, health, and basic necessities was improving for the majority of people. They had little reason to doubt that the country was progressing towards becoming a modern, powerful, independent state, and the eventual liberation of their oppressed, impoverished southern compatriots was inevitable. So what happened, right? Like I said, think about that documentary we saw in the 1980s in South Korea. Things were not going well. And so North Koreans had this kind of sense of confidence. Things were getting better, and it seemed like they would continue to go better. So we had to kind of figure out what happened. And a lot of what happened was basically the North just tried to keep doing what it was doing, right? The North is not going to change, even when it seems like it needs to change. Now, it's true that by the late 1970s, the South Korean economy had overtaken the North. But in that whole business with the assassination of Park Chung-hee and the Gwangju massacre, South Korea's GDP dropped by 6% from 1979 to 1980. And the North Koreans saw the political, social, and economic unrest that was occurring in the 1980s in South Korea. So, and this is one thing we have to really emphasize in this course. We really have to try and understand things from the North Korean perspective. Understanding is not the same thing as agreeing. But if you were, say, Kim Il-sung and his son, Kim Jong-il, in the late 1970s and 80s, you said, okay, things are going bad in South Korea. They're going to get worse, right? There's this political, social, and economic unrest in South Korea. Let's just stay the course. We'll just wait for a good opportunity, and then there'll be unification. Either they will overthrow their government and they'll install a new government that wants to unify, or something, the military situation will change and we can invade. Something's going to change. And all these other problems we have, we can deal with them later. And that's one thing I have to stress is sometimes difficult to get information about what's going on in North Korea. And so that last part is kind of my guess. But I think that's how the government understood things, right? Our major focus now is unification. Once we get unification fixed, then we can worry about these other things. So let's just stay the course. South Korea could fall any day now, right? That government could fall any day now, and we'll either have a friendly government or an opportunity to use our military to achieve unification, right? That's my guess. I think the government of North Korea just thought we just need to wait this out. Eventually things will get better. We'll have an opportunity. Let's just wait. We can fix everything else later. And in a sense, because of this, North Korea is just going to kind of stumble through the 1980s, right? Because it just doesn't really understand the situation correctly, right? North Korea does not understand the situation correctly. There's a lot of wishful thinking in North Korea. And the problem is because, and you may remember this from the earlier lecture, they suppressed dissent, right? Basically, the top people in the government were all Kim Il-sung's former guerrilla buddies. They got rid of anyone who would disagree. And of course, after they were gotten rid of, no one's going to disagree. So no one's there to correct their misunderstanding, right? You're going to tell Kim Il-sung what he wants to hear. And so he can make mistakes and no one is going to point out that he's wrong, or even perhaps realize he's wrong because he'll only promote people who think like him. So what happened is, I think fundamentally, the North Koreans misread the situation in the South. Being anti-government, anti-US does not mean being pro-North Korean. So for example, there were strikes. Workers led strikes in South Korea, massive strikes. But that doesn't mean that they're pro-North Korean. North Korea didn't want to have independent unions, right? North Korean workers had to do what the state told them. That's not what South Korean workers wanted. South Korean workers wanted independent unions and collective bargaining. They did not want North Korean-style government at all. And the problem was, whenever you had this kind of opposition to the South Korean government, North Koreans, I think, tend to read that as pro-North Korean support, and that was completely wrong, right? There was a non-communist left, such as Kim Dae-jung, who were wanting to build a different kind of South Korea but not one that was similar to North Korea. The North Koreans also missed the fact that a lot of what this unrest was about, this is kind of ironic because they were communists, that they're supposed to all know, or they supposedly are communists, they're not communists, was they missed the rise of middle class, right? Communists are supposed to all be about understanding class conflict and class war and the rise and fall of different economic classes. But a key thing that they missed was that much of this kind of unrest was caused by the rise of a middle class who wanted political power, right? In South Korea, you had these people becoming wealthier. You had a middle class. They wanted to say in the government. Middle class people generally not want to become like North Korea, right? People with property who have freedom and who want more freedom don't want to be part of a system where they lose their property and their freedom. So the problem is North Korea's hopes were blamed on a complete misreading of what was going on in South Korea. South Koreans were not pro-North Korea, and the rising power in South Korea was not going to be pro-North Korea. They also missed problems in their own economy. The North Koreans were highly dependent on aid from their allies and loans from their allies, principally China and the Soviet Union. And that allowed them to not deal with the fact that their non-market economy was terribly inefficient in terms of producing goods and distributing goods, right? The government tried to control the economy completely, and it got the closest to any totalitarian government to do that. And it was really bad at making sure people got enough stuff. First of all, making sure they produced enough stuff and making sure that people got it. And they were really bad at economic planning, right? Remember, who's in charge? A bunch of guerrillas led by a guy who had a high school education. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with people who don't have a big education, but you're not going to be good at organizing something that's complex with an economy if all you have is the equivalent of like a high school education. It's just not enough if you're going to be taking on this responsibility. There was also too much emphasis on the military spending and heavy industry, right? They neglected consumer goods and they neglected anything that didn't directly deal with the military. And so because of that, they didn't upgrade their equipment. They didn't modernize. So the same equipment that they were using in factories in the 1950s, that's what they were still using in the 1980s. And they did a really rotten job maintaining that equipment, right? Their major focus is unification, is on the military. They want to be ready for a military struggle any day now. So just that kind of long-term thinking is gone. They're not concerned with investing in upgrading their infrastructure or anything like that. And they can stumble along like this because of the aid, because of the loans that they're getting from other communist countries. Even though, like I said, I don't technically think of them as communists. And I'll talk more about this later. But in any case, they're stumbling through the 1980s. There are significant structural problems in their economy that they are not dealing with, in a large part because they are distracted by this hope that South Korea is going to suddenly want to join with them. And in a sense, because of this, North Korea is just going to kind of stumble through the 1980s, right? Because it just doesn't really understand the situation correctly, right? North Korea does not understand the situation correctly. There's a lot of wishful thinking in North Korea. And the problem is because, and you may remember this from the earlier lecture, they suppressed dissent, right? Basically, the top people in the government were all Kim Il-sung's former guerrilla buddies. They got rid of anyone who would disagree. And of course, after they were gotten rid of, no one's going to disagree. So no one's there to correct their misunderstanding, right? You're going to tell Kim Il-sung what he wants to hear. And so he can make mistakes and no one is going to point out that he's wrong or even perhaps realize he's wrong because he'll only promote people who think like him. So what happened is, I think fundamentally, the North Koreans misread the situation in the South. Being anti-government, anti-US does not mean being pro-North Korean. So for example, there were strikes. Workers led strikes in South Korea, massive strikes. But that doesn't mean that they're pro-North Korean. North Korea didn't want to have independent unions, right? North Korean workers had to do what the state told them. That's not what South Korean workers wanted. South Korean workers wanted independent unions and collective bargaining. They did not want North Korean-style government at all. And the problem was, whenever you had this kind of opposition to the South Korean government, North Koreans, I think, tend to read that as pro-North Korean support, and that was completely wrong, right? There was a non-communist left, such as Kim Dae-jung, who were wanting to build a different kind of South Korea, but not one that was similar to North Korea. The North Koreans also missed the fact that a lot of what this unrest was about, this is kind of ironic that because they were communists, that they're supposed to all know, or they supposedly are communists, they're not communists, was they missed the rise of middle class, right? Communists are supposed to all be about understanding class conflict and class war and the rise and fall of different economic classes. But a key thing that they missed was that much of this kind of unrest was caused by the rise of a middle class who wanted political power, right? In South Korea, you had these people becoming wealthier. You had a middle class. They wanted to say in the government. Middle class people generally not want to become like North Korea, right? People with property who have freedom and who want more freedom don't want to be part of a system where they lose their property and their freedom. So the problem is North Korea's hopes were blamed on a complete misreading of what was going on in South Korea. South Koreans were not pro-North Korea, and the rising power in South Korea was not going to be pro-North Korea. They also missed problems in their own economy. The North Koreans were highly dependent on aid from their allies and loans from their allies, principally China and the Soviet Union. And that allowed them to not deal with the fact that their non-market economy was terribly inefficient in terms of producing goods and distributing goods, right? The government tried to control the economy completely, and it got the closest to any totalitarian government to do that. And it was really bad at making sure people got enough stuff. First of all, making sure they produced enough stuff and making sure that people got it. And they were really bad at economic planning, right? Remember, who's in charge? A bunch of guerrillas led by a guy who had a high school education. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with people who don't have a big education, but you're not going to be good at organizing something that's complex with an economy if all you have is the equivalent of like a high school education. It's just not enough if you're going to be taking on this responsibility. There was also too much emphasis on the military spending and heavy industry, right? They neglected consumer goods and they neglected anything that didn't directly deal with the military. And so because of that, they didn't upgrade their equipment. They didn't modernize. So the same equipment that they were using in factories in the 1950s, that's what they were still using in the 1980s. And they did a really rotten job maintaining that equipment, right? Their major focus is unification, is on the military. They want to be ready for a military struggle any day now. So just that kind of long-term thinking is gone. They're not concerned with investing, upgrading their infrastructure or anything like that. And they can stumble along like this because of the aid, because of the loans that they're getting from other communist countries. Even though, like I said, I don't technically think of them as communists. And I'll talk more about this later. But in any case, they're stumbling through the 1980s. There are significant structural problems in their economy that they are not dealing with, in a large part because they are distracted by this hope that South Korea is going to suddenly want to join with them. So North Korea has a really brittle economy that is fundamentally dependent on outside help to feed its people, to maintain its military, its infrastructure, all of that stuff. One of its main supporters was the Soviet Union, and in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. And every single country that had been a part of the Soviet Union, every one of the republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, stopped being communist. Now, this was a huge deal for North Korea because they just lost, in a sense, a major ally. The response, I think, is very interesting. People in North Korea in the government were critical that the Soviet Union fell, and I quote, without firing a shot. That's disturbing because what that means is that North Korea may want to go out in a blaze of glory. But also, for the short term, that was a huge loss in terms of aid and foreign support. And let me give you an example here. The trade with Russia in 1990, so the year before the Soviet Union fell, was worth $2.56 billion. It fell to $0.14 billion in 1994. It was $0.11 billion in 2011. Well, what does that mean? It means that basically the Russians were giving the North Koreans huge amounts of money because North Korea was a part of the Cold War alliance against the United States and the Western powers and against South Korea. But now Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, wants to work with those powers, is not part of an anti-American alliance or anything like that. And so they want to now actually trade for real. This was aid disguised as trade. The Soviet Union was sending, the North Korea, like MiG jet parts and like tanks and things like that, and oil. In exchange, they were getting pickles and bad tobacco that no one wanted to smoke. So it wasn't really trade, it was really aid. And now that the whole communism thing, this whole alliance is gone, Russia wants real trade. And when it went to real trade, now it goes way down, right? So this is a huge blow to North Korea. They just lost a couple $2 billion in aid. And when you're a small country like North Korea, which only has like 20, 25 or so million people, that is a huge loss. And then Kim Il-sung dies, right? In 1994, just a few years later, Kim Il-sung will die, the guy that has led North Korea since the late 1940s, right? So for almost 50 years, the leader will die. Now, this creates a crisis in North Korea in the sense that, this guy who had been in charge for a long time died. However, he had managed to put his son in a very strong position and basically made it clear that he was going to be his successor. So there was an orderly succession from father to son, right? From Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il. And in the State of Mind documentary, he's the guy who's leader of North Korea when that occurs, right? So things are not going well for North Korea in the 1990s. And that is when the famine will really break out, right? North Korea has now lost a lot of its aid that had made up for the structural problems in its economy. And North Korea, frankly speaking, it's the northern part of Korea. It's not good for farming, right? It's very hard to farm in North Korea. It's too cold. There's not a lot of land. There's a lot of mountains. North Korea's wealth is more mineral-based and industrial-based. So they really needed to have large inputs of like fertilizer and oil and things like that in order to make their farming work. And they're not getting that. So that will lead to a massive famine. The public distribution system, in which the government would extract food and then redistribute it to people, basically breaks down. And it also distribute all their consumer goods. And so people are now pretty much left on their own to try and figure out how to survive. Now, this will be blamed on an economic blockade, things like sanctions and bad weather. But frankly speaking, much of this had to do with the fact that the government had a terrible economy. It tried to control the economy completely and wasn't very good at doing that, and had made a lot of bad economic decisions. And there were structural problems that had to be dealt with, and it didn't want to deal with them. Now, this is presented as an arduous march that simply had to be endured by the North Korean people. It's just, it's those imperialists are causing a problem. We had bad weather. We just have to endure it and keep fighting to maintain our socialist system. But it will kill about 500,000 North Koreans, which is about 2.5% of the population. So a huge number of people will die during this famine. And even though North Korea is not in a famine situation right now, at the time of recording this video, they do not have food security, right? They're still dependent on food aid. And you could have another famine if there are further problems. So things are not going well in this way. So now we need to kind of deal with this question. Why, when you have a country that has such a bad economy where it can't even feed its people, why are they working on nuclear weapons? Right? Why are they working on nuclear weapons? So I need to kind of deal with this situation. So in 1985, North Korea had actually signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where they basically promised not to develop nuclear weapons. And they didn't really want to sign it, but they were pressured to do it. And the Soviet Union and China said, don't worry, it's cool. We both have nuclear weapons. We'll protect you. It's fine. In 1991, though, the Soviet Union fell. In 1992, North Korea threatened to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and actually secretly began making weapons. This was discovered, and in 1994, the United States and other countries developed what was called the Agreed Framework, in which North Korea promised to give up nuclear weapons, its nuclear weapons program, in exchange for aid and nuclear reactors that could not be used to make nuclear weapons, but could be used to produce power, electrical power. This does not go well. Neither side really delivers on its promises. In particular, North Korea is very bad, and then it just goes on ahead and keeps working on the nukes, even though it just promised not to do so. I won't go too much into the history other than to note North Korea has several nuclear weapons and is developing its missile technology to be able to launch them and hit someone with them. Having a nuclear bomb isn't that big of a deal because you need a delivery system, but North Korea is working on them. My understanding is at the time of this recording, they have one that could conceivably hit the western part of the United States. And you don't have to be terribly accurate with a nuclear weapon to kill lots of people. Now, in this section, I go more into my opinion, especially about North Korea. And I'm always happy when there's talks and there's hope that North Korea will somehow get rid of this program. But just to be perfectly blunt, I don't think North Korea will ever give up its nuclear weapons program voluntarily. I just don't think they're going to. And here's why. First of all, North Korea has a terrible army. Basically, its army, even though it may be huge, it's made up by a lot of guys who are malnourished, who have aging weapons, who barely have enough fuel and ammunition to do really much, except blow the heck out of Seoul, right? They could basically, what would happen is if war was to break out, North Korea would just blast Seoul with all of the weapons it has and kill perhaps millions of people. So that's a problem. So from the North Korean perspective, they know their army's terrible. And so this is the one thing that gives them security. At the time of this recording, no two countries that both have nuclear weapons have ever gone into war with each other. Countries that both have nuclear weapons do not fight each other. And so North Korea's logic is, if we have these nuclear weapons, no one's going to invade us, and they're right, at least up to now. Also, this allows North Korea to threaten the world, to say, hey, pay attention to us, give us stuff, or else, we may go nuts and drop these bombs. I shouldn't say may go nuts, but I think they want to give that impression, right? Even though I argue North Korea is rational in many ways, the regime is, I'll talk more about this later, they do, I think, want to appear kind of crazy because then people won't mess with them. And they can use nuclear weapons to threaten and to get aid, and I'll talk more about that later. But also I think there's a sense of pride there, right? The North Korean regime doesn't just want to survive, it wants to be respected, right? Or at least feared. And nuclear weapons gives them that, right? You've got to take North Korea seriously. And even though North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, right? People have to take it seriously. Why? It has nuclear weapons. So that then brings us back to this question, right? Why does North Korea act so provocatively, right? So I've explained now, in a sense, why North Korea wants nuclear weapons, even when its people are starving. Why then, though, does it act so provocatively? Why does it threaten, right? You may have seen a while back, there was this video they made of them basically blowing up New York City. Why would you make such a video? Can you imagine the United States, government sponsoring a video in which we show Pyongyang being destroyed, right? We wouldn't do that. So why then does North Korea act so provocatively? Well, first of all, one thing we have to point out is you can kind of think about it as a cost-benefit analysis. It costs North Korea very little to behave provocatively. So in the past, North Korea has launched like mortar strikes against a South Korean village. It's very near the border. And, they'll behave provocatively. Why? Well, South Korean probably retaliation wouldn't hurt them much. If North Korea kills some South Koreans, that will really hurt the South Korean government because South Korea is a democracy. The citizens will be upset. They'll be like, what did we do that made the North Koreans do this? But if the South Koreans or anyone really kills a few North Korean soldiers, North Korean government doesn't care. It's not democracy. So North Korea, in behaving provocatively, what can they lose? They can't lose much. Moreover, other countries are fearful of regional instability and would prevent other retaliation, right? So why don't we launch airstrikes on North Korea when they act up? We do it to other countries. We launch cruise missiles and things like that because China would be extraordinarily angry. South Korea would be angry. Japan would be concerned, right? So North Korea can act provocatively knowing that not really much can be done against it. And then what happens is North Korea can then bring attention and possibly aid in exchange for negotiations. And one thing, and watch this happens over and over and over again, right? It's like the same old thing. It's really striking that you can use this to predict things. You can really impress people because you can totally predict what's going to happen. North Korea engages in this kind of cycle. They will want to create tensions for some reason, right? They'll launch a missile, they'll do something. Then they'll call for negotiations, and they will ask for and receive aid in exchange for backing down, right? Create tensions, call for negotiations, in exchange for backing down, get some kind of assistance, money, oil, food, whatever, and then they back down. They win. Right? This is one thing I want to stress. North Korea always wins these things. That's why they're geniuses, evil geniuses, I think, in terms of the government. But the North Korean government's smart. Don't think they're rational. They totally play this game over and over again, and usually it works, because what are we going to do? Bomb North Korea? Not going to happen. At least that's my prediction. So the other thing we have to remember, though, is a lot of North Korea's actions are not based for international consumption. A lot of them are based mostly for domestic consumption. So here's the thing. North Korea does something provocative. The United States responds by sending our fleet closer to North Korea or issuing statements against North Korea. And then the North Korean news will show film of the American fleet or of the American president saying negative things about North Korea and say, look, we are under siege. We are under threat. You need to trust our government to protect you, because look at these outside threats. Look what the American president is saying. Look what the American military is doing. And North Korean people are like, oh yeah, we're under threat. And of course, eventually we back down. And then the leader can say, look, I protected you. See, there was a threat. I protected you. And the North Korean people are like, oh yeah, I guess he did. How else can they know otherwise? It's very difficult for them to know otherwise. So they just kind of put up with it. So one reason North Korea acts so provocatively, it costs North Korea very little. It wins them a lot, both internationally and domestically. So we've been trying to deal with this kind of contradiction. We have a country that has economic infrastructure that is very bad, very poor, that needs reforming, that can't even feed its people without foreign aid. Now, a logical thing to do would then be to imitate Chinese reforms, right? A logical thing to do would be to imitate Chinese reforms. After all, they worked, and now China's very wealthy. And one thing I want to point out, China, before it underwent the economic reforms, had successfully developed nuclear weapons. So North Korea, it doesn't have to have this contradiction. It doesn't have to have this contradiction of not being able to feed its people and having nuclear weapons and developing this program. If it undergoes Chinese reforms, just like the Chinese, it could have both nuclear weapons, that is security, and economic reforms, right? But that's not what happens, right? And Michael Seth here, I'm going to quote him again. He's referring to what happens after the famine of the mid-1990s. And basically, this situation continues to describe much of what North Korea is experiencing today. To sum up, North Korea's reforms, while significant, were often poorly conceived, inconsistently implemented, and avoided fundamental changes to its economic system. Right? So North Korea does undergo economic reforms in the 1990s and early 2000s in response to this famine. They were at best attempts to adjust to the new economic realities of the country, where factories were shuttered, food rations were not being distributed to workers, and thousands of families were engaging in sideline activities to survive. So basically, these reforms are not really anything like this kind of vision that the Chinese leaders had, especially after the 1990s. It was basically just figuring out how to stumble on. And while improving, overall economic output and living standards were well below what they had been 20 years earlier. So we had this really weird situation. North Koreans are becoming poorer now, not wealthier, right? North Koreans are the one group of people who we talked about who would really like to go back to like the 1960s in terms of their economic lives in East Asia. No one else would really want to do that. And it's really weird because North Korea has a good model that they could imitate. Chinese reforms, which have worked fabulously well, right? So it's really this kind of bizarre situation from our perspective. North Korea could keep its nuclear weapons, engage in Chinese reforms, and improve life for its people. Why doesn't it? Before I try to answer that question, though, of why doesn't it do that, I want to note what it does do. This, again, is Michael Seth, North Korea New History. By the 1980s, if not earlier, those at the very top, this is in the elite of North Korea, enjoyed a lifestyle unimaginable to ordinary people, driving expensive German cars, drinking French cognac, and having access to other imported luxuries. The hereditary nature of the ruling elite also became more pronounced over time. By the time of Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, most of the younger high-ranking officials were the sons, nephews, or in-laws of the old guard. North Korean politics by then could be seen as rivalry among powerful elite clans. In other words, it's pretty much like the old Chosun dynasty. So rather than pursuing economic reform, any kind of serious economic reform that would allow North Korea to feed its people, instead the government has decided to use its limited resources to take care of the elite. Right? It's made a conscious decision to focus its limited resources on the elite rather than trying to reform the system to make things life better for all North Korean people. So what's going on here? How does this make any sense? If we want to be charitable, we could say, well, the regime has connected itself to Korean identity. For North Koreans, it's hard for them to fathom anything other than what they have and still be Korean. There's still this myth that the South Koreans are basically like the slaves of the Americans, which is why we have troops there. And if you want to stay authentically Korean, we just have to deal with the system. So for North Koreans, especially among the elites, and I'm saying this if we want to be charitable, if we want to understand them as being, led by ideological concerns, it's hard to imagine a Korean nation without the North Korean government, because the alternative is to be under the control of the United States. Right? So for them, being Korean can only authentically happen in North Korea, because the only other option is South Korea, which is a puppet of the United States. And to kind of think about this, remember the Japanese emperor, how he was willing to sacrifice all these Japanese people to maintain the throne? Well, on one side, I think that was just selfish, poor behavior, to be blunt, because he considered himself the parent of the people. Parents don't sacrifice their children. At least good parents don't. But at the same time, his understanding of what it meant to be Japanese had the imperial throne at the center. Japanese people could still die, but as long as the emperor was still around, Japan as a nation continued to exist. So you had at all costs to protect the emperor, because to be Japanese was to be a child of the emperor, to be to be one of these people ruled by the emperor, the descendant of Amaterasu. And so it was unthinkable for the Japanese emperor for anything to happen to him in the imperial system, because that would be the end of Japan. I think North Korean elites, especially those on the very top, I think they think that way. We're the last authentic Korea. We may not be rich, we may have all these difficulties, but at least we're free to be Korean. And if something happens to North Korea, that's the end of Korea as an independent nation. At least we're free. We're independent. Can't really say free. At least we're independent. And remember, Emperor Gojong did something similar, right? The last monarch who was actually able to effectively rule. When he wanted to modernize Korea, he understood as being what was good for the dynasty is what's being good for the nation. He could not think of a Korea which is not ruled by his family. And so I think among the Korean elite, North Korean elite, charitably speaking, for them, they just can't think of a way of being Korean without the present regime. That's idealistic. Practically speaking, if you want to understand why the North Korean government does this stuff, it's because its focus is on regime survival. So, for example, when we look at North Korea and we say, wow, why aren't these North Koreans? Why aren't they taking care of the people? Why doesn't the North Korean government care about its people? Because that's not what its focus on. Its focus is on regime survival. The key thing that the North Korean government wants to do is survive. The key thing those elites that we just talked about in the previous slide want to do is to survive. You got to keep them happy. You got to keep them united, and you got to keep them in control. So the North Korean government, its major goal is keeping the elites happy. That's what gives them all that stuff. If they can keep the elites happy, they can control society. And the people who are starving people don't rebel. They're malnourished, they're weak, they're spending their time trying to figure out how to survive. So they don't care that people are starving. Starving people are good, as long as not too many starve. Because our major goal is regime survival. People out in the provinces die, who cares? Keep the cognac flowing, because that keeps us in power. And here's the thing. Even if you, again, I'm going back to trying to be charitable, even if you're a North Korean elite and you don't like this system and you don't believe in it, you know that if you loosen controls, you would likely be overthrown and likely killed. the North Korean people, as you saw in the video clips, many of them have been mistreated. Many of them hate their government. And if the government were to allow them, they would gladly get rid of the government, and then unify with the South, which is much more wealthy. So if the North Korean elites, the North Korean regime does loosen its controls, does allow the free flow of outside information, does allow North Korean people to resist in any way, they would likely be overthrown and lose power and have a good chance of losing their lives. Right? Remember that documentary, The Secret State of North Korea? Remember that anger that a lot of North Koreans feel towards their government. And the North Korean government is aware of this. If you want to really understand North Korea, I think a fascinating book to read is The Real North Korea by Andrei Lankov. Andrei Lankov is fascinating because he's a Russian who went to study abroad in North Korea in the 90s. And he speaks English, Russian, and Korean fluently. So he actually lived in North Korea for an extended period of time. And he wrote this fascinating book called The Real North Korea. Our library has it because I had the library buy it. And here's a couple quotes from that. These are North Korean officials. Human rights and the like might be a great idea, but if we start explaining it to our people, we will be killed in no time. Which I think is a wonderfully appropriate quote. And one thing that Andrei Lankov noted was there's always this question, what has happened to the former East German party and police officials? When Koreans want to talk about unification, they always look at Germany as a model, right? Because East and West Germany were divided by the Cold War and then united. And they say, okay, let's look at them to figure out how we could unify. And the North Koreans are like, if we unify with the South, what's going to happen to us? If I'm an elite North Korean, what's going to happen to me? Well, what happened to those former East German party and police officials? Right? So we have to understand, and, the North Korean elite is in many ways kind of in a difficult situation, right? What can they do, right? They either need to defect or just keep on fighting, trying to keep the system there, because if they try and do anything else, they're going to lose their positions, likely get killed. Now, a common thing that people will say is, why doesn't China do something about North Korea, right? Why doesn't China do something about North Korea? And one thing that kind of makes me concerned with that perspective is you can kind of see in this comic. And this comic just annoys me all get out. Like, it really frustrates me. But I like to use it because it shows some, I think, subconscious problems with the way Americans view the situation. So here you have the Uncle Sam, who represents a father figure here, right, to the child South Korea. And it says, do something about your child, Mom. And then you can see North Korea threatening South Korea. War attack, girl, I'll nuke you both. And then you see China as this kind of angry-looking mother. Now, this is highly problematic because Koreans are not children. I mean, young Koreans are children, but you know what I mean, right? Korea is not a child country, right? Korea has been an ancient country that governed itself quite well for a long time until people decided that, why let a country be independent? Let's just take it over. So this is just extraordinarily insulting to Koreans, right? Presenting them as children. It's also therefore fundamentally inaccurate, right? South Korea is not a child. It's especially not a weak child. And it makes it sound like we can just control the Koreans, like a parent should control its child. We can't. We can't just tell South Korea what to do and expect it to do it. It's a democracy. And China cannot just tell North Korea what to do. And one South Korean diplomat, in trying to explain this situation, said basically North Korea, or rather I should say China's ability to do things in North Korea are very limited. And the analogy he gave is he said that China's tools in North Korea is basically limited to a hammer. China could hit North Korea over the head with a hammer and knock it out. Is that a good thing? Right? And what he means by that is that basically China could reduce or cut off aid completely to North Korea. That's what it can do. It could also invade North Korea. Those are about the only things it can do to get to North Korea to get it to listen. Right? It doesn't really have any other leverage over North Korea. Sanctions? North Korea doesn't care. Hurting the common people of North Korea? North Korean government doesn't care. So all that China can do to North Korea in a sense is reduce or cut off aid completely or invade North Korea. Neither one of those options are particularly positive because too much pressure and North Korea government could conceivably collapse, which would not be a good thing because it would probably lead to war or at least to massive violence in North Korea and a serious refugee crisis as North Korean civilians started pouring into China or into South Korea. South Korea. And there's a large ethnic Korean population in Chinese territory. And so China is very nervous about all this. So first of all, there's a problem with just the assumption that China is like North Korea's parent and can just tell North Korea what it can do and it will do it. But in reality, China is very limited in what it can do about North Korea. And China is very concerned, it has to live next to North Korea, that it could be significantly affected by any kind of collapse in North Korea. And one thing I want to emphasize, I do not like the North Korean government one little bit, but I don't want to see it just collapse, because that would be dreadful. That would lead to massive amounts of chaos and violence, and a lot of people would die. And it's especially scary because remember, people in North Korea said, the Soviet Union, how could they fall without firing a shot, right? It's kind of scary. Now, I do need to say something about the relationship between Japan and North Korea, because this is a class on East Asia. So one thing that's very curious about Japan and North Korea is that large numbers of Koreans are living in Japan. That's one thing I want to mention. Koreans are kind of an invisible minority in Japan. So you'll have people who look Japanese because Koreans and Japanese don't look that different. And they speak Japanese fluently because their families have lived in generations in Japan and they have Japanese names, but actually they are ethnically Korean. And they were usually Koreans who came over in like the 1920s, 30s, or 40s, and for whatever reason didn't leave Japan. And what's really weird is, and I won't go too much into detail, but they don't have Japanese citizenship a lot of the time. In the United States, the law is that if you're born in the United States, you have U.S. citizenship. That's not how things work in Japan. So you've got these people who look Japanese, who speak Japanese fluently, who've lived generations in Japan, but who might not be citizens. And that community is divided because some of them align with South Korea and some align with North Korea, right? So let's say I am a Korean who immigrated from Northern Korea in the 1930s. I'm going to be part of that community that's pro-North Korean. And those Koreans connected to the North have historically sent money home to their families. And for a long time, that was an important source of income for North Korea, was this money that Japanese Koreans were sending home. Ironically and sadly enough, the North Korean government loved that, but they also suspected Koreans who had Japanese contacts, so you could get thrown in jail for having contacts in Japan who sent you money. You don't want to be in North Korea, not one little bit. Never go to North Korea, at least not under the current circumstances. And one thing that caused problems and that caused conflict between Japan and North Korea is that there was a program, I think it was in the 70s and 80s, where North Korean agents would go to Japan. Like they would take like a boat to Japan and they would find like a beach and they would hang around in the beach in the early morning. And when like someone would jog on the beach, the North Korean agents would kidnap the Japanese person and bring them to North Korea and force them to teach North Koreans how to speak Japanese, right? This sounds bizarre, so let me repeat it. North Koreans would like hide in beaches and wait for like, you're a jogger, you go out at 6 a.m. to go jogging, and they would like kidnap you and force you to go to North Korea and keep you there. That made relations between Japan and North Korea not so good, as you can guess. And occasionally, as you can see in this image, North Korea likes to shoot a missile over over Japan, which of course reminds the Japanese that, hey, they could hit us with a nuclear missile if they wanted to. So relationships not so good between Japan and North Korea. Now, after that aside, I do need to say something about North and South Korea in terms of unification. Both countries are officially for unification. Supposedly, the younger generation of Koreans in the South don't really care that much about unification. They don't have family members that they remember living in the North, right? If you were a South Korean who has family members living in the North, you really are into unification. You want to see your dad again. You want to see your sister again. But, it's not as stronger for the younger generation, though there are still ones who want unification. But one thing that makes it so difficult is the economic cost, first of all. So the German economic ratio basically was 3-1. What do I mean by that? When West and East Germany wanted to unify, basically West Germany was 3 times as wealthy as East Germany, and they had to pay the cost to help East Germany catch up. So it cost the West Germans a lot. In the Koreas, and I think this has only increased, we're not quite sure because North Korea doesn't release authentic, or what I can say, believable statistics. But South Korea is probably between 15 and 40 times larger in terms of its economy than North Korea. So instead of a 3-1 ratio, there's a 15 or 40-1 ratio. So how the heck could you possibly unite with that. It's going to cost the South Koreans a huge amount of money. And when you have this kind of difference, it would basically be being South Korea eating North Korea. And North Koreans, they don't want unification if it means that they have to be basically the servants of South Koreans. So the idea of just having instant unification, no one really wants that. There's talks more of like a federal system or a confederacy or something like that, because they're just two different countries now. The unification now would have South Korea eating North Korea. So a lot of times what they try and pursue are building cooperation over time. So for example, they established a resort in North Korea that South Korean tourists would go to. And it was pretty popular for a while till a guard shot a South Korean tourist who had supposedly gone to a place she wasn't supposed to go. Unfortunately, the video cameras were not working, supposedly, that were there. So we're not really sure exactly what happened. But, that kind of hurt the resort plan when, a North Korean guard killed a lady. Which was completely unnecessary. I mean, you didn't have to shoot her to get her into the area she was supposed to be in. And occasionally there was a Kaesung industrial park, which would open and close at various times, in which North Koreans would work and make money that would then, a lot of it would go to the regime, some of it would go to the workers, but it made products that could be then sold in South Korea. And this was run by South Korean businesses in cooperation with the South Korean government. But the idea is, let's build cooperation over time. Let's help North Korea develop economically. Then unification down the road will be easier. The problem is North Korea cuts it off whenever it threatens regime survival. Right? So anytime, whenever you watch the news and it sounds like North Korea is going to actually do something about unification or do something about getting rid of its nuclear weapons, chances are it's not going to do it. It's only pursuing those options because it thinks it needs to help its regime survive. As soon as it possibly threatens regime survival, North Korea will cut it off. And that has happened over and over again. So that makes unification that much harder. So the current leader of North Korea at the time of the recording of this video is a man named Kim Jong-un. He is the grandson of Kim Il-sung and the son of Kim Jong-il. So what happened was, in 1980, Kim Il-sung basically, it's complex, but we can use the year 1980, will choose his son, Kim Jong-il, to succeed him. And he had 14 years to develop his power before he actually had to become leader of North Korea. He built lots of connections in the military. He had lots of proteges, lots of people who were basically under his influence. So he had a smooth succession. It was clear that he was going to be the successor. He had built up his own network of power. Now, the problem was he had multiple sons, and for various reasons, they lost favor, and it wasn't clear who was going to be the next leader until 2008. In 2008, Kim Jong-un became the most likely successor. Then in 2010, he and his aunt, Kim Jong-il's sister, would become 4-star generals, and then Kim Jong-il died. And I think he died earlier than he thought he might. He thought he would probably live longer. Of course, we'd always like to live longer. But what that meant was Kim Jong-un would succeed in power in 2011. He only had 3 years to build up a network. Kim Il-sung had 14. So Kim Jong-un is going to succeed without as much power. And that's one reason why I think he ended up being more violent. You may know him as being famous for having his uncle arrested in the middle of a meeting, and then within a week he was dead. The uncle. And you have to take that kind of harsh treatment when your position is weak. And his position was very weak. He didn't have time to build up. There was hope because he was educated in the West. He had like a 3-year stint, I think it was in Switzerland, studying. There was hope that he would be a reformer, but there's been no meaningful reform yet. Right, early on, especially, and that's why I chose this picture, because he's visiting like a fun park. There was hope that, this guy's going to be more fun. He appeared with his wife. North Korean leaders historically did not do that. There was hope that there was going to be meaningful reform. It hasn't happened yet. And unfortunately, for the reasons I have outlined, I don't think it will happen, right? Because reform threatens the regime. If North Koreans actually undergo economic reforms that will help North Korean people get wealthier and learn more about the outside world, like the South Koreans in South Korea, they will likely try and change the system. And that's not good for the elite. So that, they're thinking regime survival. I don't think they're going to change. And I pity the poor North Koreans because of that. And actually, in a sense, I pity Kim Jong-un because there's no way you could pay me enough money to have that guy's job, right? In fact, you can't pay me enough money to go to North Korea. People will often say to me, Dr. Alish, have you ever been to North Korea? And I'll be like, nope, not going to go. because I want to leave. And sometimes North Koreans don't want you to leave. They want to arrest you for some trumped up charges or whatever. And they'll probably figure out something to arrest me for. So I would rather go visit South Korea. So I have to kind of wrap things up in a sense. And being a Koreanist, I chose a poster, right? And this poster is in Korean, right? I'm a Koreanist, I'm going to choose a Korean poster. No offense to Japan and China. I thought I could do this as my privilege. And also, though, to emphasize that a lot of what's going on in Asia is centered on Korea, right? One thing that's fascinating about this class, I think, is how you have these two giants, China and Japan, the second and third largest countries or economies in the world at this time, and how much of their policy, how much of their history is driven by Korea, this very relatively small country. And the poster says, it says Peace in East Asia International Meeting. Right. Oh, and there's that's my translation. You can check their translation was International Conference for Peace in East Asia. Both are correct. And that's our hope, right? That peace in East Asia will continue. We started this class in a long period of peace in East Asia, from the middle of the 17th century until the later 19th century. In many ways, East Asia experienced a large amount of peace. Through the upsetting of that international order in large part because of Western imperialism, though, we have a massive reshuffling of things in the 19th and 20th centuries. A lot of things changed. But we have seen how in more recent history, in the last couple decades, there's been a lot of economic convergence. With the exception of North Korea, all the countries we've discussed have followed economic policies meant to make the people wealthier. There, however, is a lot of political and cultural divergence as well, right? The People's Republic of China and North Korea both are pursuing what are essentially authoritarian regimes, though very different in many ways. Japan, the Republic of China, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, have, on the other hand, embraced liberal democracy. What does that mean? I'm not sure. My hope is that the economic agreement will allow enough basis for continued peace, that the differences in politics, culture, and of course the history problem that we discussed earlier will not be enough to upset the peace that we currently enjoy in East Asia. The big question, of course, are the islands, and more importantly, North Korea. Right? The North Korean issue might be one thing that could lead to an upsetting of this peace. And my hope is that will not happen. Of course, as a matter of principle, I want people to enjoy peace. I want people to enjoy prosperity. But of course, as a person who studies East Asia, I have a special affection for China, Japan, and Korea and the people of those countries. That just naturally happens when you study something. It's just like you have a family. You have a natural affection to your parents, to your brothers and sisters, and so forth. And it's my hope that they will continue to enjoy peace. It's my hope that in this class you've learned something that will be useful, that at least it was interesting to know about these countries. And I hope that you've developed also a personal relationship, an emotional attachment to these countries and their peoples, and that this will help contribute to international peace and prosperity.